What I'm going to talk about a little is the history of education policy, and particularly federal education policy, because I think that if we're going to talk about any of these issues, especially federal education policy, we all need to have a sense of where it is in the context of overall education in America. But you could also more accurately describe what I'm going to talk about as why the word education is not in the Constitution, that oft-forgotten document, the Constitution, from which the federal government gets its powers. So we're going to talk about that, but we'll put it in historical context to really understand why it's not in there. So why isn't the word education or anything similar? You won't find the word school or schooling or anything like that. Why isn't it in the Constitution, especially among the specific enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, really the only powers that the federal government has? The short answer is, of course, that the founders hugely feared a central government with lots of power, and they didn't consider education at all something that you could only do through a national government. So some things they said we've got to give to a national government, including defense and things like that, because it's the only level of government that can effectively exercise these powers. Not so in education. In fact, as we're going to talk about, the founders wouldn't have believed there was really any governmental role, most founders, in education. But before we get to that, there are always people who object when I say, well, that the Constitution gives the federal government no authority to be involved in education. And they'll say, aha, smart guy, what about the General Welfare Clause? Doesn't the General Welfare Clause give the federal government authority to do that, anything that's in the general welfare? And of course, you all probably know this, so I won't spend much time on it, but the answer to that is, of course not. Federalist 41, Madison makes very clear that the only reason the General Welfare Clause is in there is to explain why the specific enumerated powers that follow it are given to the federal government. So it's given those few limited powers in order to promote the general welfare, among other things. Then others who've spent more time trying to figure out how to get the federal government to do things it's not allowed to do would say, oh yeah, okay, wait a minute now, but didn't Hamilton essentially give the federal government broad powers in the taxation and necessary proper clauses? They could do anything that was in the national interest through those clauses. And that's what he argued in his 1791 report on manufactures, if you really are into your history. And to that I'd say, sorry, again, wrong. He did say those things in his report on manufactures, but in Federalist number 33 rather, he was very clear in saying, no, that's not the case. Of course, Federalists were written to get people in New York to support the Constitution. So this is essentially how they sold the Constitution. So we're hoping he's telling the truth in this, is what he really believes. And he says you don't need to fear that these give the federal government overbroad powers, because they only are in there for the execution of specific enumerated powers. Again, we go back to those specific enumerated powers that say nothing about education. Finally, those people who are really hell-bent on saying that the federal government can be in education, and there's no question about that, will say, well, it's just kind of an oversight. Obviously, the founders wanted the federal government to have a role in education because we had the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the Land Ordinance of 1785 that said, look, in territories controlled by the federal government required that a portion of each sale of land, the proceeds would go to supporting education. Clearly, they wanted a federal role. Now, of course, 1787, 1785, these things preceded the Constitution. So they really tell us nothing about what the Constitution says about education. It's not in the specific enumerated powers. But the Constitution does give the federal government authority over territories. Check out Article 4, Section 3. So the best you can say is, well, the constitutional part is, yes, the federal government had some authority over territories. So you might say that, okay, in that regard, it's okay for the federal government to be involved, but we're not talking about territories anymore. We're talking about states and school districts. So again, that simply does not hold. So I think we've pretty well established that there is no power given to the federal government to be involved in education. Almost no, and I'll get to the one exception, well, a couple of exceptions. The other one is the District of Columbia, like territories, the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction over that. So the irony, if you follow your school choice debates, is you got lots of complaints about local control when the federal government is trying to implement a voucher program in D.C. And that's kind of ironic because the one place that doesn't have local control is the District of Columbia. That the federal government can be involved in. So a little bit of our history, very brief. There'll be things I skip. We can talk about it afterward if you want to. Why is no education in the Constitution? Because most founders, like I said, would never have considered it a government responsibility, much less federal. Education in the colonial period and the early Republican period was assumed to be the purview of homes, of churches, of individual communities, not of government. This is where education took place. And most of the founders completely accepted that. This didn't actually begin to change the understanding broadly in society of where education should come from until you really get to about the 1830s. Horace Mann, the Common Schools movement, really just starts in Massachusetts and a few other northern states. And that's when people begin to argue, well, what we need is government to provide a sort of single system of schools so that everybody can basically be the same. And of course, this was elites, political elites, saying by the same, everybody should be kind of like us, and we don't like people who speak different languages or things like that. So lots of concerns about that. But that's just the beginning. So we've gone from the early 1600s to 1830 with education being in the home. You then get to the 1860s. In the 1860s, the federal government makes its first major education law, not really about K through 12 schooling. It was something called the Morrill Act. Land grant colleges. It was mainly about agriculture, really, and some manufacturing. And what's notable about this happening in the 1860s, early 1860s, was that there was a big section of the country that was not represented in Congress, the South. Those states that had been most vociferous in saying there are limited federal powers. So this only happened when a big part of the country was no longer represented in Congress. Then the next big federal move in education was to say, after the Civil War, if a state wanted to be readmitted to the Union, it had to put provision of education in its Constitution. Again, this isn't that the whole of American society was changing. It's that part of the country had obviously left, and the other part said you want to return. These are the rules. And then, now, we're going to go to 1957. That's a big jump now. We're talking about 1600 to 1957, before the federal government really does much of anything else in education. There was a second Morrill Act, which basically did what the first Morrill Act, expanded it a little. But other than that, not much. And we didn't really even have much new state control. We did, though, have lots of centralization of districts, lots of control where progressives said, look, you can't let individual communities or people control education. We've got to have scientific control of it. So this is where you start to have school boards. You have standards and testing, which we'll talk about a lot. Tracking kids, saying most of you are going to go on to work in industry, like what Emmett was talking about, and a few of you will deem worthy of going to do something else. So you have lots of centralization at kind of the district level, but not much else. 1957, anybody know what big happened in 1957 that would have gotten people kind of scared? Yes, Sputnik, right. So Sputnik goes up. People get scared. They think, uh-oh, we're about to lose the arms race to the Russians. In fact, Eisenhower knew that that wasn't the case, that we technologically were advanced of the Soviet Union, but people got scared. So for the first time, we have a major federal initiative in education, although still tied to national defense, which is a legitimate federal area of interest. And they said, look, this isn't mainly geared at K through 12, but the federal government is going to get more teaching of science and technology and engineering and produce more teachers with a focus on that and more foreign languages. And what drove this was really politics, not policy, because, again, Eisenhower knew we weren't behind technologically, but this is what people were demanding because they were scared. But Sputnik falls. We go back to debates in Congress for a few years of, can the federal government even provide some aid to hire teachers or build new school buildings? Those are regularly defeated. But then you get to the mid-1960s and you have a different kind of war that's really not related to national defense, and it's the war on poverty and the Great Society. So now we've gone from the early 1600s to the 1960s before the federal government's really had much of any role in education. That is a huge period of time that we were managing to educate kids without any federal involvement. So this is when you get the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is really what No Child Left Behind is, and the Higher Education Act and some other stuff I won't go into. But then you got to go to 1979, and that is when we create the Department of Education. And the Department of Education, again, was driven by politics, not policy. What you've got to know is that in the 1970s, early 1970s, the National Education Association went from being an actual professional organization to a full-fledged teachers union. And for the first time before the 1976 election, they said, we will be endorsing a candidate for president. And oh, by the way, that means we will be supplying lots of foot soldiers for your campaign who tend to have extra time during the summer to do a whole lot of campaigning because that's summer vacation. Jimmy Carter, running, said, look, I want to get that support. I will promise to create a U.S. Department of Education, making it cabinet level. So you've got real connections in Washington, and the NEA endorses him. Now, what's interesting is even President Carter didn't really want to rush to have a U.S. Department of Education. His own secretary of the then Department of Health, Education, and Welfare said, you don't want this. You don't want to have this separate, basically, lobbying group for education. But Carter dragged his feet, and eventually the NEA said, if you want our support going forward, you've got to do this. So they basically twisted his arm. He twisted Congress's arm, and just barely the Department of Education was eventually created. And it went into operation in 1980. And that really now takes us to 2002. And in 2002, largely through Republicans, President George W. Bush, Republicans in Congress who wanted to support them, we get the No Child Left Behind Act. Until this time, basically what the federal government did was supply money to low-income districts to try and compensate for a lack of resources. Now, there was no evidence that money ever helped. In fact, there was lots of evidence it was squandered. Not a good thing. But that's what they did. They didn't try and control education. But with No Child Left Behind, that changed. For the first time, the federal government dictated to every state the basic structure of their education system. They had to have state standards in math, science, reading. They had to have all kids to something called proficiency by 2014. They had to make yearly progress toward that goal, and this was the federal government dictating to every state and therefore every district and every school. So we've gone from the 1600s to now just 2002 before the federal government started to make dictates like this. And then you get to the really concerning, well, No Child Left Behind, extremely concerning, but we ramp it up starting in 2009, but officially in 2010 with the race to the top. $4.35 billion out of the so-called stimulus. And the Obama administration basically said, if you want to compete for this, you have to do what we tell you to do, what we, the Obama administration, tells you to do. And among those things was you have to adopt national standards, a national curriculum for all intents and purposes, and national tests, which the federal government is paying to develop. And so we now have the federal government, through Race to the Top, not just dictating the framework, but dictating the standards that all states would have to use. And so this was actually, and there's a great, could you hand me that since you guys are on here? There's a great report that just came out, The Road to National Curriculum. It came out yesterday. APP is one of the sponsors of it, and I meant to bring it up here. But it lays out there are lots of statutes, go beyond the Constitution, which of course is all we should be worried about, but statutes that say the federal government can do nothing to coerce adoption of specific curricula, yet that's exactly what it did in Race to the Top. And just yesterday, we upped the ante even more, with the Obama administration saying, look, Congress has not moved as fast as I want it to rewrite the No Child Left Behind Act. So we're going to tell states, if you want to get out of this law, and it's a law that makes very little sense, but if you want to get out of it, you have to adopt reforms that we dictate to you, and then we will give you a waiver to get out of it. Again, among these is adopting national standards, national curriculum. And what's really concerning about this is we have now multiple violations of the Constitution. Not only is the federal government not allowed to be in education, but now the Obama administration said, to heck with separation of powers. I've deemed that Congress hasn't moved fast enough, and I will make you adopt the reforms that I want. And importantly, No Child Left Behind does say that the Secretary of Education can issue waivers. It does not say you can issue waivers that require states to adopt reforms that the executive department says they should. So essentially, we've said there's no more separation of powers. That's irrelevant. So we've gone from no government involvement, for the most part, in education in the 1600s, a very long period of time without any government involvement, to all of a sudden we're at the point where a single person, the President of the United States, can dictate curriculum to everyone. This should be extremely concerning to everyone. I don't see enough concerned faces, but I hope you're concerned. So if you want to look shocked and concerned, feel free. So the question now is, just to get a little more context, a little, well, I'd say a little less frightening than Big Brother taking over, but it shouldn't be less frightening. What have we gotten for all this federal involvement? Well, the first thing is one good thing: the end of segregation at state and local levels. This is completely legitimate role of the federal government. In fact, it's a requirement through the 14th Amendment that ensure there be equal protection of the laws, especially in government provision of services or anything government does. A terrific thing that the federal government did. It went beyond that, I think, in forced integration and lots of bad things. But this was a completely critical thing that the federal government did. Unfortunately, on that one good thing, we have to pile on lots and lots of bad things. Billions, if you want to count, well, hundreds of billions, trillions, if you want to count every dollar as one bad thing. So just to give you a little bit, just a basic sense of what we've gotten for our money. Real per pupil federal spending on K through 12 education has well more than doubled, and this is so inflation adjusted, in the last 40 years. But if you look at 17-year-olds' achievement on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and I use 17-year-olds because they're basically high school seniors, the final product of our system, absolutely flat, stagnant. Total federal spending, so not on a per pupil basis, but total federal spending on K through 12 education erupted from $32.6 billion in 1970 to $115 billion in 2010 to produce no achievement gains. Kind of amazing, actually. I also want to throw in higher education. I haven't focused on that as much, but this is now a focus because it's so expensive and there's so much student debt, and the president is saying, look, I'm going to begin to dictate like No Child Left Behind to colleges and universities. Well, what have we gotten for federal involvement so far? Massive increases in student aid that have largely translated into astronomical tuition increases that just eat that money and give it to the colleges and universities. So, again, just a few numbers. Inflation-adjusted aid per pupil, most of which is federal, has ballooned from about $4,000 per pupil in 1971, adjusted for inflation, to almost $14,000 in 2010, nearly a quadrupling of aid per pupil. Overall, federal aid, the overall pie, now this includes loans, which have to be paid back, so don't think of this as all just a giveaway of money. Think of it as mostly a giveaway of money. But that's gone from $21.1 billion in 1971 to almost $170 billion in 2010, a more than 8-fold increase adjusted for inflation. And what have we gotten for it? We don't have good long-term data, or at least one long-term test we can point at that most people take, but we right now have a 57% graduation rate in 4-year programs within 6 years. So just slightly over half of people are finishing a 4-year program within 6 years. Most of those people are not done within 6 years, will never finish. That is massive waste for students and society. We, of course, have these gigantic price increases, which everyone is familiar with. We actually have falling literacy rates for people with bachelor's degrees and higher. Now, we only have that number from 1992 to 2003, when there's National Assessment of Adult Literacy. But to have dropping and precipitously dropping literacy rates among degree holders should be shocking and shows the huge oversupply of students we have, or too many people in college, largely because you, the taxpayer, are having your money given to them to go consume that education. And of course, we have credential inflation, blah, blah, blah. But some might be asking, because there's some conservative who supported No Child Left Behind, and we hear this a lot, didn't at least No Child Left Behind provide transparency and accountability? Things that we didn't have before. You know, we have test scores for the lowest performers and things like that. And maybe that is why a lot of people supported the law. They think you'd get this transparency. Of course, we know we didn't, because states and districts gamed the law. They defined proficiency in myriad ways. They kept changing their tests, all to dodge any sort of accountability. So if you'll hear your child is proficient, that means nothing, because the definition of proficiency is usually low and constantly changing. But if you look at NAEP scores, National Assessment of Educational Progress, you can begin to break down improvements for overall students, for subgroups, things like that. And what you see is there are lots of periods before No Child Left Behind that had faster achievement improvements for low-income kids, for kids who are English learners, all sorts of other groups. A lot faster before No Child Left Behind than under No Child Left Behind. In fact, if you look at No Child Left Behind, largely the scores in the aggregate are kind of flat. In other words, there is no evidence whatsoever that all this transparency and accountability we supposedly got has done any good. So even what many people will tout as the one good thing about the law, at the very least, has not translated into any meaningful improvements. So Washington, I think it's fair to say, has failed in education, and the problem that we face is kind of government-wide, but every time it fails, and we have evidence it fails, we tend to give, federal government takes, but we also give it more unconstitutional power to try and fix the problems that it caused or at least didn't fix before. And that's now we just have more money with more controls with no improvements. And now the president is saying, look, you haven't fixed No Child Left Behind fast enough. I will dictate to you what to do to fix all the things that you guys did bad before. So this is where we are. Obviously, it's very concerning. Now, the tendency is to say, well, we just give control back to states or to local governments. That is better than federal control. First of all, it's constitutional, and you don't want to have a single centralized dominant power in education. But we are wrong if we say to people that that is enough, that it's okay to just devolve power to states and local governments. Why? Because all governments suffer from the same basic problem, and it's concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. Basically, those people with the most to gain or lose from something government does are the most involved in the politics of it, because they're the most motivated. It's very normal. Makes sense. In education, that's the people whose jobs come from the system, the teachers' unions, the administrators' associations, and that's the case at local, state, and federal level. And so they always have disproportionate political power because they're the most involved, they're the most motivated to be involved because it's their very livelihoods, and they're most easy to organize. And so what do we have to do? It's not enough to say get the federal government out of education. I mean, that would be a huge step. But we have to be demanding universal school choice in the state levels, and it's the states that have constitutional authority. They could tell local school districts, everyone's going to have school choice. Why is that important? Well, I mean, there's several reasons you want universal school choice. And this is critical, it cannot be enough to give the money just to parents. You have to give educators freedom too. What you want is a free market. Why do you want a free market? One, that's real accountability. It's not accountability where you have to go through a 20-year political process and hope you can get something changed, at which point your kids are adults. It's real accountability because if a school's not providing what you want, you say, I'm going to hold you accountable right now. I'm going to go somewhere else. That's real accountability. But you also want that educator freedom because you want a market, because markets are about more than just accountability. That accountability leads to competition. And that competition requires innovation, that people do things better, they do things different way, and you can only innovate if you've also freed the providers to try new things, to try different things. And that is absolutely essential. So it's not enough to say, well, we just want a school choice program for 500 kids, where they have to choose a school that follows lots of rules and regulations. It's got to be a free market. It's got that instant accountability, it's got the competition, innovation, and specialization. One thing the national standardizers put blinders on to is a very basic reality of human existence. And for anybody, I like to say this, people laugh, but it really is kind of true, is if you've ever met more than one child, you know all children are different. They learn at different rates, they have different interests, they have different talents, and you need a system where they can match up with people who specialize in their talents, needs, desires, whatever. And that can only come from a true free market in which we have also freed providers. And one last thing that I think is critically important, and this goes to why there's a lot of popular support for public schools, is the idea that public schools or the government-run schools are the only thing that can unify diverse society. And that it gets it exactly wrong. And if you are familiar with the creationism debate, if you have ever been in a school or in a school district where people said, I don't like a particular reading selection, or where someone's wearing a t-shirt that someone objected to and the school said you have to take it off, or any of the myriad things we're constantly fighting over, you know that a single system of government schools for diverse people leads to conflict, and conflict leads to division, because we all want different things out of education. And so one last critical thing about having a real market, real freedom in education is it lets us have harmony because it doesn't force diverse people to fight with each other. So that now leads me, and I promised to be brief and I probably wasn't, why is education not in the Constitution? Because the founders never would have thought it should be there, because they believed education was something that should stay in civil society with free people. And the last 40 to 50 years of federal involvement have proven them exactly right. Thank you.